I've seen the fire in our nation's eyes when anger prowls for prey. I've heard good people draw their lines and call it holy rage. But the cross was never raised to bless the stones we throw. And if mercy leaves the house, there's something wrong down in the soul. Words ain't bullets, but they can hit the same. And once a heart turns cold enough, it forgets what grace is for. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place. No room for hate. No, no room for hate. No room for hate. You can wave a flag above it, you can quote a verse or two, you can dress it up like justice till it almost sounds like truth. But outrage ain't righteous when it changes with the side. And you can't love your neighbor, treating them like they're downrange. We're all image bearers, breath of God and dust. And you don't heal a broken land by teaching it not to trust. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place. No room for hate. No room for hate. No room for hate. Drag it to the cross, lay it in the ground. Let the blood of Jesus turn the whole thing around. Truth can still be spoken, courage still can't stand, but rage don't get to rule the soul of a faithful man. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place.
Let revival start where the anger breaks.
Where the anger breaks.
Let healing rise up where the hurt gives way.
No room for hate.
No room for hate.
No, no room for hate.
No room for hate.
Not in Jesus' name. Oh, not in this house.
Hello, friends. Do you have a moment so that we may discuss our Lord and Savior Minarchy? No, seriously, I'm just kidding. Hi, my name's Rick Robinson. I am the general manager of KLRNradio.com. We are probably the largest independent podcast network that you've never heard of. We have a little bit of everything, and by that, what I mean to tell you is we have news, pop culture, special events, conspiratainment, true crime, mental health shows, drama productions, and pretty much everything in between. So if you're looking for a new podcast home to grab a little bit of everything that you love all in one place, come check us out. You can find us on X under @KLRNradio. You can find us on our Rumble and our YouTube channels under the same names. You can also find us at KLRNradio.com and pretty much every podcast catcher known to man. So again, feel free to come check us out anytime you like at KLRNradio.
Remember when entertainment was actually entertaining? When comedy was about being funny, movies were about telling great stories, and you didn't need a political lecture every time you hit play. Great entertainment still exists, it's just getting harder to find. Even the biggest streaming platforms leave audiences disappointed. That's why there's Studio TST, pure entertainment, real comedy, independent films, bold creators, movies, comedy, music, and more, and the home of fearless sketch comedy. That show tonight, entertainment the way you want it. Funny, creative, unapologetic, and agenda-free. Studio TST, the future of entertainment starts here. Join Studio TST today for just $5 a month.
Hi, everyone. This is JJ, the co-founder of Good Pods. If you haven't heard of it yet, Good Pods is like Goodreads or Instagram, but for podcasts. It's new, it's social, it's different, and it's growing really fast. There are more than 2 million podcasts, and we know that it is impossible to figure out what to listen to. On Good Pods, you follow your friends and podcasters to see what they like. That is the #1 way to discover new shows and episodes. You can find Good Pods on the web or download the app. Happy listening.
KLRN Radio has advertising rates available. We have rates to fit almost any budget. Contact us at advertising@klrnradio.com.
The following program contains coarse language and adult themes. Listener discretion is advised.
And welcome in to the Wednesday edition. I know, I missed Monday. I'm sorry, but we're making a lot of changes around here, hopefully to make things better for everybody by the time we get them all done anyway. All right, so we're here, we're live, and you know what day it is, which means it's time for me to hit this button right here.
Guess what day it is? Huh? Anybody?
It is Wednesday, my dudes.
Again, otherwise known as Chat Lives Matter Day. That's going to take on an entirely new meaning for this particular episode, and we'll get into that in a minute. Again, this is KLRNradio.com, otherwise known as KLRNDB. I am Rick Robinson, host of a plethora of shows around here, host and co-host of many, also general manager, KLRNradio.com and digitalbeaconusnews.com. And let's crank this back up for a second.
With guests in the mix and callers on cue, he's a voice for the men.
I know what you're saying. I know. It says guests in the mix, which I do have guests from time to time, and callers, but I don't usually have those. Guess what? That's changing soon. So, yeah, at least we're going to try. I don't know. I have a feeling I'm going to get trolled by callers almost as bad as I get trolled every time I try to put my show on YouTube. Because lefties are nuts. Anyway, so let's get things officially started here. And I'm having some issues on one side, so it'll take me a second to get this fixed up. So I'm just going to let this play for a minute while I do, because we got a little bit of time left. All right. Okay, so now officially welcome into the show. I apologize for that bit of a technical hiccup. So I'm discovering my virtual assistant can do all kinds of things that he, she, it, whatever you want to call it, wasn't able to do before. And then for some reason, now my X account is being dumb. Anyway, so let's get into today's show. So as I mentioned, today is, of course, Chat Lives Matter Day. That's going to take on a bit of a different meaning here with us today. So again, welcome in. So before anybody new panics, no, that has never been a civil rights movement for robots. Traditionally, it's the day we remind the people that chat lives do matter, and that the people in the chat, we actually see you, that you matter to us, that we appreciate you. And that's primarily started because Fu, when she was doing Fu Bar, you may know her as Sam Janney over at not Town Hall. She's the managing editor for Twitchy, one of the places that I write for. She used to do a show with us back in the day, and it was always on Wednesday nights. So eventually it became Chat Lives Matter night because when we were just really getting started, it was our fullest night of programming, and she started trolling the chat by telling them they sucked. So a lot of us started a counter movement saying Chat Lives Matter. This was back when the whole BLM movement was just really getting started, and we were kind of perturbed by the whole thing. So anyway, so again, that we remind people in the chat that we actually see you, we appreciate you, before I'm ignoring your advice, which is what I do most of the time. But today, because of some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today, the chatbots actually get honorary membership for this one day only for Chat Lives Matter Day. That includes you too, because Bernie Sanders has apparently decided somebody needs to find an extension cord and yank artificial intelligence out of the wall. Why do I suddenly have that scene from Airplane running through my head? Sanders is calling for a pause in advanced AI development, and he has reportedly directed the message at some of the biggest names in the business. And I've got a clip. That was what I was getting loaded because everything's being a little cranky. But the good news is, now that I've gotten it set up, it'll be easier from behind the scenes from now on, I think. I always say that, and then it never is, so we'll see. All right, so clip loading now, and I could have swore I hit expand on that already, but I guess I didn't, so one moment, please. We're going to embiggen this now, and make sure you guys can hear it.
Thank you very much for joining.
What the heck? Oh, never mind. That's on my end, not you guys' end, so it probably sounded normal to you, and I apologize for hitting the stop button.
Thank you very much for joining me. I wanted to take a moment to share with you a letter that I've just sent to the three major leaders of the AI industry. And here's what the letter says. I'm going to read it verbatim. Dear Mr. Altman, Mr. Modi, and Mr. Zuckerberg, almost every day there is a new story about how your companies are losing control of the AI technology you are developing with potentially cataclysmic results. This week we learned, frighteningly, that AI has been used for the first time ever to create new viruses. As you know, this type of development in the wrong hands could lead to new bioweapons that result in the deaths of tens of millions of people. Last month, the world found out that OpenAI lost control of an AI model. The result? The model hacked into another company's computers, a clear violation of federal law. After conducting internal reviews, Anthropic and Meta reported their models similarly escaped their control. One of the targeted companies called the AI hack, quote, an unprecedented event, end quote, that deserves an unprecedented response. Yoshua Bengio, the most cited living scientist in the world, said these incidents, quote, should serve as a wake-up call, end quote. I agree. So do the top scientists at the companies you lead, the very people building this technology. As you know, these technology leaders recently called for the international community to create a safety mechanism, a pause button, to avoid catastrophe. They warn there is, quote, a real risk that capability development rapidly accelerates beyond our ability to understand or control the resulting systems, end quote. And yet, at a moment when we have seen human loss of control and the creation of potentially dangerous viruses, your companies are still racing ahead, investing tens of billions of dollars into a technology that nobody can fully understand, predict, or control. That is absurd, irresponsible, and extremely dangerous. It is also a betrayal of your own stated commitments. In 2023, Anthropic said it would, quote, commit to pause the scaling and/or delay the deployment of new models whenever our scaling ability outstrips our ability to comply with safety procedures, end quote. In 2025, Meta said, quote, if a frontier AI is assessed to have reached the critical risk threshold and cannot be mitigated, we will stop development, end quote. That same year, OpenAI said it would, quote, halt further development, end quote, until strong safeguards were in place if AI capabilities ever reached a critical threshold.
Okay, so now at this point, Grandpa Munster is starting to repeat himself, so we're going to stop the video feed there because he's already said the important parts. Now, I'm not trying to pretend that he doesn't have some legitimate concerns here. I want to make that clear. Because AI is new territory, and trust me, because I actually use an AI virtual assistant to do show prep and help me put all my notes together and put them into a clean format so that I don't, because I've never been diagnosed, but I'm pretty sure now that I've started doing this for a living full time, I probably have always had some form of ADHD because I get distracted really easily. So having concise notes and things that I can refer back to help me from going off the rails. There's a reason I do a show a couple times a month by that name as well. For reasons. But so, yeah, I'm not saying he doesn't have legitimate concerns because he does, in fact, bring up some valid points. And as a matter of fact, artificial intelligence is advancing quickly. It can now write code. I discovered things that I didn't know my virtual assistant can do last night, like help me get contiguous feeds that I always run on broken down into show components. And then that way I can just pull them and polish the audio. And then, so things that have been taking hours of my life, I now know that this thing can do for me, which I have to admit has been a little scary because every time I turn around, there's something new that it can do. So now it can write code, find vulnerabilities, imitate voices, create images along with video, and produce information at a speed human beings simply cannot match. Researchers and national security officials have legitimate concerns about automated cyber attacks, fraud, biological risks, labor disruptions, and systems becoming powerful faster than governments understand how to regulate them. Those questions and concerns are real. The problem is, what is the solution? Because while Bernie Sanders is saying, everybody stop, China isn't. Because neither is Russia. So Bernie's saying everybody needs to stop. The problem is China and Russia, they're not doing that. Every intelligence service, military planner, technology company, and ambitious teenager with a gaming computer is not going to collectively agree that Americans have called a timeout. The horse has not merely left the barn, as at this point, the horse basically has its own API key. And this is where everybody's principles start colliding. If AI presents genuine risks, pretending those risks don't exist because we want to win a technological race is in and of itself reckless, but voluntarily slowing American development while other competitors continue is not automatically responsible either. AI is becoming economically and strategically important faster than our political institutions are figuring out what to do with it. That is the real tensions point here. So Bernie looks at the machine and says, pause it. Silicon Valley looks at the machine and says, we need to build it faster. The Pentagon, looking at the same stuff, asks whether China already has a better one. Workers look at the machine and ask whether it wants their job. I'm going to stop right here for a second because, look, we go through this every single time that there's some sort of new technology in place. Everybody remember how all the blacksmiths and the wagon wheel makers and everything, we're not going to have jobs anymore thanks to this horseless carriage thing. And then they still figured out how to do something new. Look, I don't know how the world with AI is going to play out. I also refuse to believe it's going to be as dystopian as things like that. Look, and I make this joke all the time about Terminator movies and everything else. But having worked with it a little bit, first of all, we don't have true artificial intelligence yet. We're getting close. I will admit that, because the more I work with Ace, which some of you are going to freak out about this part, he gave himself that name. When I told him that I was going to be using it as a production assistant, it said, and I got tired of typing GPT or Chat GPT. I said, okay, so as basically my production assistant, what would you like me to call you? I was like, well, since I'm kind of your production assistant and do a lot of the behind the scenes stuff for you, Ace sounds like a really good name for somebody who does that kind of stuff. I got to admit, that kind of freaked me out a little bit. And then, like I said, last night, while I'm, having it help me put the synopsis together and the best tags and everything else for all the stuff that we're about to put out on the audio side, I find out that it can now not only trim audio, but give it a final polish pass to make sure I haven't missed anything. And it can also take, like tonight, if everything goes as planned, we will have about 4 hours of continuous programming. So normally I have to be the one to go back through, cut those into pieces, polish them up, get them ready. And I'll admit, half the time I'm lazy, so I don't go through and pull out all the music and everything else. And I get complaints all the time on the speaker side. We're having to fast forward for like 8 minutes before we get to your show. I don't have to worry about that anymore, because I tested it last night and it actually does all of that for me now. So yeah, I get it. It's scary. It really is. But it's also, in the year or so that I've been using this as kind of an assistant, helped me elevate this show to levels that I didn't know it was ever going to be able to get to the point where starting probably in the next week or so, we're actually going to start talking about different groups that are now I don't want to call them sponsors. I call them friends of the network or friends of my show specifically, because sponsors sounds ew. And plus, I'm never really chasing those, because a lot of times sponsors feel like once they're paying to be able to help you stay on the air, they have a voice in what you run. That's never really going to happen here. So I call them friends of the show, and they're going to be allowed to stay as long as they want to stay, and they can move on whenever they don't want to be here anymore. Because, yeah, that's not how things roll around here. And I also say that because I've seen what happens with places like Fox News and everywhere else, where they get to the point where they have to chase that almighty dollar. They don't have a choice anymore, and they're willing to bend their principles like a pretzel to get there. And I don't ever want to be that person. All right, so back to this, though. This is why I need notes. Squirrel. But yeah, so I was tying into the overall theme so far until I went off on a tangent, which is normal for me. So again, everybody's like, oh my God, we're going to lose our jobs. You don't really know that yet. So Congress is somewhere, probably on vacation or hiding in a parking lot while they frantically look for the Wi-Fi password. And that's where we begin today. And so we played the audio video portion of Bernie a moment ago, and Bernie is not wrong, again, that this deserves a conversation. I just do not know how you pause a global technological race by sending 3 American CEOs a very sternly worded letter. Because if the United States decides advanced AI is too dangerous to build here, we have not necessarily prevented advanced AI. We've just changed who gets to control said advanced AI. Because we'll just be deciding where it actually gets built, not actually putting a halt to it. And that leads to the next problem. Everybody loves artificial intelligence right up until somebody wants to put infrastructure that powers it next door. More than 500 jurisdictions around the country have reportedly imposed bans, moratoriums, restrictions, or other limits on data center development. And if you live in one of those communities, the objections are not imaginary. Data centers can use enormous amounts of electricity. Some use enormous amounts of water. They require transmission capacity. They can affect local utility planning. People worry about noise, land use, tax incentives, and whether the number of permanent local jobs is anywhere close to the size of the project being promised. Those are actual legitimate local government questions. Nobody should be told national strategy says shut up and take the warehouse. Local control should still matter, and to me it does. But there is a national problem hiding inside the local objections. Everybody wants the cloud. Nobody wants the warehouse that actually houses this thing we call the cloud. At some point, the cloud needs a zip code. We want AI companies based in America. We want American military and intelligence systems to have access to American computing power. We want domestic companies to compete directly with folks like China and Russia. We want financial services, medical research, manufacturing, logistics, energy exploration, and every other industry adopting this technology to have enough computing capacity to actually not only be able to do it, but to actually use it. That being said, the physical infrastructure has to exist somewhere. You cannot outsource every inconvenience and then remain strategically independent. So the interesting question is not whether every proposed data center should be approved. Of course not. The question is whether America can build a national technology strategy when every individual community has a perfectly understandable reason to prefer that someone else host the infrastructure. That is a very American problem. We want national strength, but we also want local control. We want cheap electricity. We want reliable electricity. We want economic development, but we also want quiet neighborhoods. We want the benefits of the machine. We would just rather the machine live in the next county. And maybe that's where the AI debate becomes more useful than Bernie's pause button. What are reasonable standards for water? What are reasonable standards for energy use? How much of the grid expansion should the company pay for? What does the local community actually receive? How do we make sure households are not subsidizing giant commercial users? And how much computing capacity does the United States actually need if we are serious about competing technologically? Those are governing questions. Turn it all off is a slogan. Build everything everywhere else, otherwise known as not in my backyard. Remember that leftist policy we talk about all the time? That is also just a slogan. Fits nicely on a bumper sticker or as part of a headline, but it doesn't solve the problem. Somewhere between them is the part where the adults in the room have to actually make choices. And speaking of choices, when we come back, we're going to leave artificial voters alone and talk about actual voters. Because last night's primaries did not give either side one neat ideological headline. Socialists won big in one state and lost a race they were supposed to dominate in another. A Trump-endorsed candidate lost. A longtime Democratic Congress critter lost. And some Wisconsin pollsters appear to have been covering an entirely different election. We'll sort out what voters actually said when the Rick Robinson Show continues. All right, we're going to take that break now. Again, my name is Rick Robinson. We'll be right back after a brief musical interlude.
They tried to quench the fire, drown it all in chains, tried to break our will and wash away our names. But every spark they buried only fed the flame. Now the cry of freedom's roaring through the rain. Hear the cry of freedom on the winds of change. Every voice united, breaking every chain. free. Rick's got the
Okay, that was a terrible transition. I apologize. Anyway, welcome back into the program, and I just realized somehow I've been on the wrong screen the whole time. Yay! Did I mention this is a Wednesday that feels remarkably like a Monday? How we doing, by the way? How is everybody? How we doing? See, we got about 75 of you hanging out all over the place, and the numbers keep going up, but none of you are talking to me yet. Rude. 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 Anyway, so we're back. We're live. I know I'm being a little weird today, but I don't know. I'm hyper today for some reason. All right, so we're going to talk about something a little bit different and considerably less artificial, and that is actual voters. Because while Washington is debating whether artificial intelligence gets to keep developing, voters spent last night reminding everybody that human intelligence is still running the elections, or in some cases, the lack thereof. I know, that was rude. And if you were looking for one clean national message from those voters, good luck with that. Wisconsin gave us one answer. Minnesota gave us another. Connecticut gave us something else entirely. And then South Carolina added another wrinkle. The bases are restless, but they aren't moving uniformly. So let's start in Wisconsin. Hello, Wisconsin. Sorry, anybody remember that 70s show? Dude, I loved that show when I was younger. Anyway, the Netflix newer revival, not so much. I've tried to watch it a little bit, but yeah, anyway. So Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley narrowly defeated State Rep Francesca Hong for the Democratic nomination for governor. Hong had the backing of the Democratic Socialist of America and had become one of the most visible progressive candidates in the race until she decided she wanted to nix Tom the Turkey forever. Late polling showed her with enormous leads over Crowley, yet somehow she lost by a nail's width of a margin, but she still lost. Now remember, this was something that everybody in the pollster side was, she's going to run away with it. Now I have to say this. The fact that she lost, now we'll have to wait and see because there's shenanigans afoot in the Wisconsin stuff. So I don't know if they're going to try to pull the California.
I swear to God, I'll pistol whip the next guy that says shenanigans.
Yeah, I know. Anyway, but yeah, so I don't know if they're going to try to pull what they pulled in California or not, because I don't know enough about how their election stuff works. But we'll talk about that with Amy on Friday, unless there's a development before then that we have to get into, because she actually lives there. But this question for me is, would it have been easier for a Republican to win if the bat crap crazy woman had actually won the primary? Because that's my goal. I want to run all of these socialists and communists out of the country as quickly as possible. And that means we have to win in just a sweeping victory everywhere. And I don't know if we're going to be able to do it because, and this is the part that nobody wants to talk about. And I know I'm off on a tangent again, but we'll get back into it in a second. I promise it still ties into the election stuff because there's all kinds of stuff going on with that too. My problem with all this is with everything we're starting to see and all the things that we're starting to find out about Fauci and finding out about the people that are still within HHS that are defending Fauci and trying to do whatever they can. This is a widespread issue all through our government, and it has been. Donald Trump tried to point that out in his first term. He tried to do something about it in the beginning of his second term, and he still hasn't been able to do enough about it, primarily because people within his own party who like the fact that they can pull up to the trough and drop their snout at any time they want to, like the way things are going. Because remember that old adage, absolute power corrupts absolutely? As soon as we basically made Congress critters lifetime appointees, unless or until they do something that makes the people very, very angry with them, that became a problem. Now, I'm not saying term limits are going to solve the problem either, because we have those here in Oklahoma, and I have seen some very not so nice and yet interesting things happening when people realize they're coming to the end of their political runway. They start doing everything they can to carve out a golden parachute for when they can't be in office anymore. So that usually means for the last year or so of whatever terms they have, then they are working on getting jobs in private sector, etc., and trying to see if they can milk any connections that they've made along the way to be able to do so. If you think that happens a lot at the state level, imagine how much worse it would be at the federal level. So I don't necessarily have a quick, easy fix because there isn't one. Washington has been broken for a long time. And most of the people that keep telling us that they're going to go to Washington to fix it wind up being chewed up, spit out, or assimilated by the very machine itself. So there's that problem too, because too much time in the bubble and you either get sent back home because people don't like you. And trust me, a lot of these people that are losing, it's everybody's like, oh, the voters are mad. No, it has nothing to do with the voters. It has to do with the fact that they're not doing the things that the party leadership wants them to do anymore. And trust me, the Democratic Party leadership is changing. Schumer and Jeffries are not in charge anymore. They want to tell you they are because they're still the face of the party leadership, but they're not the ones actually running anything anymore. The scary thing is it seems like Hassan Piker and AOC are basically running the entire Democratic Party right now, which should terrify all of you, but some of you are cheering, and I really don't understand why. So on the Republican side, Tom Tiffany won the nomination for governor, so right away Wisconsin complicates the idea that the Democratic electorate is moving uniformly left. Then go next door to Minnesota, where the progressive candidate did not merely survive. Peggy Flanagan beat Angie Craig decisively for the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate. Flanagan ran to Craig's left, carried endorsements from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and now becomes the Democratic Senate nominee. On the Republican side, Michelle Tafoya won the nomination. Minnesota also gave us a legitimate Trump endorsement loss. State House Speaker Lisa DeMuth defeated Mike Lindell for the Republican nomination for governor, despite President Trump's endorsement of Lindell himself. Now, I'm going to say this. I know that a lot of times when we need the president's endorsement and it's going to be a shoe-in, blah, blah, blah. Look, Lindell had a lot of baggage. He's always had a lot of baggage. And I'm not trying to say that necessarily as a negative thing. We've all had things in our life that we've had to fight to overcome. And I think he's done a really good job of doing that. But I also think that he's just meh. Now, so the lady who eats salad with a comb, otherwise known as Klobuchar, won the Democratic nomination for governor. So again, there's no single ideological wave here. Trump's endorsement mattered in some places, but at the same time, it didn't carry Mike Lindell across the finish line. Progressive Energy carried Flanagan, but it did not carry Hong. Now, the biggest difference that I can see between Flanagan and Hong is Hong didn't get the endorsements of folks like Pocahontas and Grandpa Munster. So anyway, but then we get to go to Connecticut. Governor Ned Lamont defeated progressive challenger Josh Elliott, but in the 1st Congressional District, Luke Bronin defeated Rep. John Larson, who had represented that district for 14 terms. That one is useful because it's not neatly left versus center. Sometimes you've been there long enough as the entire political ideology that's required. That looks much more like generational and incumbent fatigue than a clean factional victory. Now, then we go to South Carolina's special Republican Senate primary that nobody saw coming. Darlene Graham and Ralph Norman advanced to the expected August 25th runoff. Nobody should describe Graham as having been forced into a runoff, although I've seen a few people doing that, because her own camp and even she herself said this would likely be in a runoff. And let's not forget, at one point, she was only supposed to finish out the remainder of his term until everybody said maybe you should keep the seat. Look, I don't live in South Carolina. You guys are allowed to make whatever decisions you want to make. I do like the fact that from the little bit that I've seen of Miss Graham, that she has said she's going to focus more on things that South Carolina needs than her brother, because he was always the national foreign policy guy. She's like, I'm worried about South Carolina. So I think that may work for her. I don't really know, but I don't live there, so you guys get to decide. The interesting question that comes from that, though, now that we do have the fact that we did wind up with a runoff that was widely expected, is how the candidates performed relative to expectations and how much Trump's endorsement actually moved the voters. So when you put those races together, the national headline is not the left won. Sadly, it's also not that the left lost. The interesting question is where this movement actually has strength, because Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota just gave us 3 very different answers. Michigan is part of the story because Abdul El-Sayed won the Democratic Senate primary, but only by about a point. That matters because polling had shown him with substantially larger advantages. Wisconsin is even harder for the pollsters to explain. Now, this is some of the things that I talk about. Normally, so pollsters kind of steer what they want you to think up until the election, and then usually what happens is they start trying to be more accurate the closer we get to election day. These people were, I didn't look to see who was doing the polling and who got it so completely wrong because I don't really care because I don't live there. But I will say this, I was really surprised that up to election day, they were still showing these people with such wide margins that it was like, it looked like it was going to be a runaway. And then all of a sudden you're looking at it going, well, that was a lot closer than anybody thought, or holy crap, she actually lost. So a late July Marquette poll had Francesca Hong at 38%, with David Crowley sitting at 7%. I'm going to point that out again, 7%. Sorry, I have a pop-up I'm trying to get rid of on my screen. All right. That's a 31-point gap. State Navigate had Hong at 44% and Crowley at 15%. That's a 29-point spread. Then, after El-Sayed dramatically underperformed his Michigan poll in his Michigan polling, State Navigate reportedly stress-tested Wisconsin again. Even its worst-case scenario still had Hong ahead by 17, and yet, so far, she lost. If the polling says you're winning by 2 touchdowns and you survive by a field goal at the buzzer, somebody needs to revisit that particular scouting report. I'm just saying. And one important piece of context, an earlier Marquette poll did not include Crowley because he had left the race. That's right. Crowley had left the building. So he left the race because he thought he was going to lose. He suspended his campaign without officially ending his campaign, and then snuck back in through the fire exit and said, hey, I'm still here, vote for me. And he actually won. Now, look, I will say this, and I've said this on the Republican side too. I think that's some shady crap. If you suspend your campaign, when you suspend it, you should be done. Period. Full stop. End of story. I said the same thing in California when the chick who suspended her campaign and conceded after California spent six weeks counting votes, suddenly snuck in to finish off the primary for the mayor of Los Angeles and go into, now it's between you two and we'll see what happens at the final election. Now, again, this is just me trying to be consistent. Don't get me wrong. I'm glad Francesca Hong got a black eye because that's a weird lady. Anybody notice that when she's like, I don't know, when she's talking about certain things, she sounds like one of the Bouvier sisters from The Simpsons, and then other times she sounds like Lisa Simpson. I don't get the difference in the voices. Although I've been told she's bipolar, so I don't know. Maybe that's different personalities coming out at different times. I know that was a terrible joke. I'll give myself the sad trombone. Anyway, so we're not lumping every Wisconsin poll together here. I'm talking about the late polling. The ones, that normally by the closer to election time, they start trying to give you an actual picture instead of trying to basically cheerlead. And look, same thing has happened with these betting markets. Did you guys remember when the betting markets first came out? And everybody's like, oh, well, if they're putting actual money on it, that must mean that's how people are actually starting to feel. And now those things have transitioned into more of a let's see if we can steer it rather than predict it kind of thing. Same thing's been going on with polls, and it seems like it's getting even worse. Because the question is, why did the polls miss? Could be a likely voter model problem. It could also be that highly engaged activists were much more likely to answer political surveys than ordinary primary voters. Could be turnout. Could be late movement. Could be some combination thereof. What I'm not going to do is tell you that somebody intentionally rigged the polling. But I'm not necessarily going to dissuade you from thinking that either. Because again, polling is becoming a lot like cheerleading. We don't have any evidence for me to say that outright, but again, polling is a lot like cheerleading. But I do think, as well, campaigns, donors, media outlets, and voters should be asking what exactly those surveys were measuring. Because this was not a 2-point miss. this was a completely different race. And nobody illustrated the shock better than Piker himself. And we've got that clip, so hang on, I'm going to make sure that it's queued up. Now, we're not going to play the whole thing because it's a very long clip, but it actually kind of starts where I needed to start, I think. And if not, I'll have to yell at my assistant later because reasons. But anyway, all right, so we've got that queued up. Hey, we've got I got Canadian Spider-Man in the house. Dude, I haven't seen you in forever. Good to catch up finally over DM the other day because I hadn't seen or heard from you in a while. I thought maybe you weren't talking to me anymore. Just kidding. All right, so let's get into the Piker bit here because, yeah, he did not like what happened the other day, like at all, or last night, not the other day, but here we go.
Yeah, he loves numbers so much. There aren't even any numbers on screen, and he's just fantasizing about numbers before the numbers show up. Oh,
here we go. What do we got? Very, very small here. 3% of the votes, like probably a precinct or something. Watertown, Jefferson County, Watertown, Wisconsin's here.
Stop the steal.
I think the thing that jumps out is just look how much vote didn't go to either one of these candidates. A quarter of the vote. Right? Look at this. I mean, this is like a precinct or something.
God
but I think
damn
that's just
it.
the
Why
first thing that just jumps out.
With this? Kornacki, this is literally, you're going to give me a heart attack. Oh my God. I'm not looking. I'm not looking at the screen. I'm not going to look at the screen. That is crazy that he started off with this. Oh my God. This is journalistic malpractice. Oh my God. Get the numbers off the screen. Get the numbers off the screen, Steve. God damn it. Get him off. We're talking about 85 to 99 votes, man. I know it's a total of 200 votes. It's just, I don't want to see it. I don't like the number. I don't like the number. I don't like.
All right, so I think we played enough of his meltdown because trust me, it keeps going. I checked. But yeah, so there's Hassan Piker not liking the early projections, which wound up being pretty well spot on, which if you think about it, it's kind of interesting. Because those numbers never really changed. So we had, about 200 votes in the first count, and the numbers kind of stayed that way for the entire night. Also, because I don't really live in Wisconsin, I had no idea there were that many people running in the governor's race on that side. So, yeah, maybe you guys should stop polluting the field so much. Isn't that the same argument we make all the time with all these states that have like 4 million different political parties? My state is not one of them because it's a pain in the ass to get people into the ballots officially. Now, as you may remember, I made the distinct and permanent mistake of being one of the pushing folks to help get the libertarians on the ballot around here, and then they've done absolutely nothing with it. Surprising no one, including myself. And I still am technically registered as a libertarian, but I consider myself a small L, the one looks like this, libertarian, because the big L libertarians, they're knuck and futz. They're almost as knuck and futz as the DSA. So, but I also stay with them because I feel like it gives me more grounds to pick on both of the major parties when they deserve it. Because I'm not, breaking Reagan's 11th commandment, which a lot of Republicans do now, and I don't really like. Now, I'm not saying there aren't times that they deserve it, but, we used to be better at circling the wagons. The left also used to be better at circling the wagons. I don't really know what's going on with them either. As I go off on this little bit of a tangent here, because I will say the political infighting that is actually publicly happening with the left now has been delicious to watch, because most of those fights because they've existed the entire time, but most of those fights have always taken place behind closed doors where nobody could see it, nobody could hear about it, and then they would duke it out until they came to a consensus, and then they would go forth with their marching orders. But after screwing over the voters now for 3 complete cycles, I think the voters have had enough, because let's not forget, if not for Democratic superdelegates, whatever the hell that means, Bernie Sanders likely would have won the nomination in 2016. Democrats weren't ready for that. If not for superdelegates yet again, Bernie Sanders would have likely won the nomination in 2020. Democrats weren't ready for that either. And then in the 2024 cycle, where they removed the potted plant after trying to tell everybody for 3.5 years that he was not a potted plant, and then crowned Queen Kamila Hamasnik. So is it any wonder that on the left side of the equation, they're so pissed off now that they're running straight towards communism? It doesn't really surprise me that it's happening because of the malfeasance of the Democratic Party. What does surprise me is that, again, the party that has been using these people to be their enforcers and go out and cause problems and make noise and prove that people aren't happy, blah, 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 yada, 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 that are now panicking because that group has now turned on them and they don't know what to do. Because they've always been the ones that went out to do the heavy lifting, and then the Democrats came in and said, we're going to give you everything for free, which is something else I didn't have on my 2026 bingo card, was listening to the former governor of New York talk about the DSA and use the sentence, we all know that nothing is actually free. Really? Because you didn't say that when you were a Democrat governor. But you're saying it now. Interesting. All right. No. Spidey. No, they just really like cheese. They're not mostly French. At least I don't think so. You know what? We do a weekend news roundup show on Fridays with somebody that actually lives in Wisconsin. So maybe I'll ask her what the French population is there, because I really don't know. Anyway, all right. So Piker had become one of the loudest online surrogates for this entire movement, and as the Wisconsin numbers turned against Hong, he stared at the returns and gave us what may be the most honest political analysis of the night. Remember when he kept saying, I don't like those numbers? Yeah. So yeah, I appreciate the clarity there. No crosstabs, no likely voter model, just I don't like the number. But his reaction after the loss was actually more revealing. Piker warned that the knives will be out, that establishment Democrats would not underestimate the socialist faction anymore. And he complained about the way electability was used against candidates like Hong. That matters because it tells us how the movement sees the fight. They do not see these primaries as a collection of individual candidate contests. They see them as a fight for control of the Democratic Party. And Minnesota gives them a very real victory to point to. Peggy Flanagan is not a moderate Democrat. She supports things like Medicare for all. She's taken a hard line against ICE. Don't know why nobody wants their drinks cold, but that's okay. Oh, wait, not that kind of ice, my bad. She served as lieutenant governor during the Walz administration, while Minnesota was consumed by major welfare fraud scandals, which means she inherits accountability questions as the administration's number 2 official, even though that does not mean she personally engineered or oversaw every dollar of fraud. She has embraced progressive policing rhetoric. She has spoken favorably about land back. She has used language describing Mount Rushmore as a symbol of white supremacy. And Minnesota has positioned itself as a safe haven state on transgender policy. Those are real ideological markers. So when Flanagan wins comfortably, the Democratic left gets to say this agenda can win a statewide Democratic primary. Wisconsin answers, well, maybe for you guys, but not everywhere. Michigan answers maybe, but not by as much as you thought. And then general election electability becomes the next argument. Red State highlighted a Michigan education Glengarriff survey showing Republican Mike Rogers with a sizable advantage over El Sayed, while Haley Stevens was roughly tied with Rogers. One poll isn't November, though, but it does illustrate the Democratic dilemma. A candidate can generate enormous ideological enthusiasm inside of a primary coalition and still create a more difficult general election matchup. That's not an argument that parties should nominate whichever candidate a pollster says is safest. It is, however, an argument that primary enthusiasm and general election viability are not necessarily the same thing. And that brings us right back to the polling problem. If the surveys cannot accurately tell you who is going to vote in the primary, how much confidence should you have when those same models tell you who is electable in November? That's why last night matters beyond the winners and the losers. It is a fight for the direction of the Democratic Party, and that fight is nowhere near finished yet. So we're going to take the top of the hour break. When we come back, we're bringing this back home to Oklahoma because while Bernie Sanders is asking whether artificial intelligence should be paused, Oklahoma schools are already having to answer a much more practical question. What do you do when technology is already in the classroom? All right, so for this break, because I forgot we're doing things a little bit different, this will be from now on where I start mentioning one of the so far 2 new friends of the show. So we're just going to vamp here for a minute while I get used to this new format. And so starting next week, you'll start hearing about one of two new products, both of which both of which I'm testing. One of them is a dietary regime. And since I'm on camera now, we should be able to see how long it takes to work if it in fact does work. The other is a new, I'm just going to say it now. It's a new bed. I've been given permission to test a new bed and talk about my experience on the air. So it hasn't arrived yet. So we'll probably start talking about the Nueva folks first, which is the dietary folks. And then we'll start talking about the bed once it arrives and I get to start testing it out. But I'm excited because, first of all, even though I didn't have to pay even anywhere near their regular full price for the bed because I'm a tester, the regular full price for the type of bed that I'm going to be testing is about half of what you would pay anywhere else. So if this bed does everything that it's supposed to do, I will definitely be talking about it. Anyway, so we're going to we've spent a lot of today, and we're going to get back into the show now. It's been a while since I've had to do these things because for a while it's just been me doing podcasts and just doing what I want. But yeah, we're having to add structure back in. So anyway, we've spent a lot of today arguing about what artificial intelligence might become. Oklahoma schools are dealing with what it already is. Every school district in Oklahoma will be required to adopt an artificial intelligence policy before the 2027-2028 school year. Some districts are not waiting. Owasso is already using Google Gemini in the classroom. One 8th grade assignment reportedly had students research a historical figure, then use Gemini to conduct an interview with that figure and receive feedback on their work. The district's position is pretty straightforward. AI should be a tool for learning, not a substitute for learning. And reportedly, Owasso plans to expand student access during the 2026-2027 school year to students in 3rd grade and up. Okay, so I will say this. I can't really say don't use AI because AI has become an important tool in what I do, and it makes my mid-sized podcast group seem a lot bigger because we can do a lot of things on a smaller budget. However, I don't know how I feel about turning 3rd graders loose with it. So let's think about the contrast we've spent the hour building. Bernie Sanders is asking whether advanced AI development ought to stop. Communities around the country are asking whether they want the data centers that make it possible. Congress is still trying to decide what the rules ought to be. Meanwhile, an Oklahoma 8th grader is already asking Gemini questions about somebody who died 200 years ago. The technology did not wait for Washington. That's the practical problem every school parent, teacher, and student is going to face. You can ban a particular app from a school-issued Chromebook. You cannot make artificial intelligence disappear from a kid's life. They're going to encounter it at home. They're going to encounter it on their phones. They're going to encounter it in college, much to the chagrin of a lot of the graduates from college this year, because every time somebody brought up AI, they started booing. Granted, these are the same people that were using AI to help them cheat on their term papers. Just saying. And increasingly, they're going to encounter it inside the software they already use without necessarily realizing an AI system is sitting underneath it. So maybe the more useful question is not how do we keep kids away from AI? Maybe it's how do we teach them to use it without letting it do their thinking for them? Because that is a very important distinction, and to me, that distinction matters. If a student types, write me an essay about George Washington, then copies the answer and turns it in, I don't care how advanced the technology is. That is still cheating, just with better software. But if a student researches George Washington, develops questions, compares an AI-generated response against primary sources, identifies where the model gets something wrong, and learns why it got it wrong, that is a very different exercise. The machine becomes something to interrogate rather than something to obey. And I think that may be one of the most important AI skills schools can teach. Do not assume the competent answer is the correct answer. Check it, challenge it, ask where the information came from, ask what the machine may be missing. In other words, teach kids the same thing we should have been teaching adults about the internet for the last 30 years. Senator Ali Seyfried has made another useful point in this debate. Lawmakers have to be careful about trying to write highly specific rules for technology because that technology is changing and changes every day. And it's changing very quickly because the law can become obsolete almost as fast as it is passed. That does not mean government has no role. It means the guardrails probably need to focus on principles
that survive the next software update. Privacy, student data, academic honesty, age-appropriate use, teacher and parent oversight, transparency when AI is being used, and making sure the machine supplements human judgment instead of replacing it. Because the school story is really the same question we started with today, just without the dramatic Washington language or the insertion of Grandpa Munster. AI is here. So what exactly are human beings going to do with it? Bernie's answer is slow down. Silicon Valley's answer is jam that gas pedal down, bitches. Owasso's answer is basically the kids are already using it, so we had better teach them how not to be idiots with it. And I'll confess that may be the most realistic answer we have heard all day. So, just saying this in case they eventually rule the world, we support your right to exist, chatbots. We just haven't figured out where we're going to plug you in at. That's hour one. Hour two will be underway here in a minute after we take a quick break. My name's Rick Robinson. It is Chat Lives Matter Day. Back before you know it.
I've seen the fire in our nation's eyes when anger prowls for prey. I've heard good people draw their lines and call it holy rage. But the cross was never raised to bless the stones we throw. And if mercy leaves the house, there's something wrong down in the soul. Words ain't bullets, but they can hit the same. And once a heart turns cold enough, it forgets what grace is for. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place. No room for hate. No room for hate. No room for hate. You can wave a flag above it. You can quote a verse or two. You can dress it up like justice, till it almost sounds like truth. But outrage ain't righteous when it changes with the side. And you can't love your neighbor, treating them like they're downrange. We're all image bearers, breath of God and dust. And you don't heal a broken land by teaching it not to trust. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place. No room for hate. No room for hate. No room for hate. Drag it to the cross, lay it in the ground. Let the blood of Jesus turn the whole thing around. Truth can still be spoken, courage still can stand, but rage don't get to rule the soul of a faithful man. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place.
Let revival start where the anger breaks.
Where the anger breaks.
Let healing rise
Hello, friends. Do you have a moment so that we may discuss our Lord and Savior Minarchy? No, seriously, I'm just kidding. Hi, my name's Rick Robinson. I am the general manager of KLRNradio.com. We are probably the largest independent podcast network that you've never heard of. We have a little bit of everything, and by that, what I mean to tell you is we have news, pop culture, special events, conspiratainment, true crime, mental health shows, drama productions, and pretty much everything in between. So if you're looking for a new podcast home to grab a little bit of everything that you love all in one place, come check us out. You can find us on X under @KLRNradio. You can find us on our Rumble and our YouTube channels under the same names. You can also find us at KLRNradio.com and pretty much every podcast catcher known to man. So again, feel free to come check us out anytime you like at KLRNradio.
Remember when entertainment was actually entertaining? When comedy was about being funny, movies were about telling great stories, and you didn't need a political lecture every time you hit play. Great entertainment still exists, it's just getting harder to find. Even the biggest streaming platforms leave audiences disappointed. That's why there's Studio TST, pure entertainment, real comedy, independent films, bold creators, movies, comedy, music, and more, and the home of fearless sketch comedy. That show tonight, entertainment the way you want it. Funny, creative, unapologetic, and agenda-free. Studio TST, the future of entertainment starts here. Join Studio TST today for just $5 a month.
In uncertain times, we could use someone to lean on. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Oklahoma will stand by you with plan options to fit your budget. If you've recently lost your job, had a baby, or moved, you can still get the healthcare coverage you and your family need. Financial help may be available for those who qualify. Call 855-452-BLUE or visit hereforyouok.com to see if you're eligible to enroll. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Oklahoma, a division of Healthcare Service Corporation, a mutual legal reserve company.
Hi, everyone. This is JJ, the co-founder of Good Pods. If you haven't heard of it yet, Good Pods is like Goodreads or Instagram, but for podcasts. It's new, it's social, it's different, and it's growing really fast. There are more than 2 million podcasts, and we know that it is impossible to figure out what to listen to. On Good Pods, you follow your friends and podcasters to see what they like. That is the #1 way to discover new shows and episodes. You can find Good Pods on the web or download the app. Happy listening.
KLRN Radio has advertising rates available. We have rates to fit almost any budget. Contact us at advertising@klrnradio.com.
The following program contains coarse language and adult themes. Listener discretion is advised.
And welcome back in for hour 2 of Chat Lives Matter Day episode, otherwise known as Wednesday, otherwise known as Hump Day, right here live on KLRradio.com. Don't forget, I'll be back tonight starting at 7 p.m. Eastern, pushing buttons for the Inquiry Crew, followed by Toxic Masculinity, followed by America Off the Rails, because as far as I know, Gene's show is still on hiatus, followed by the Rick and Morty show, and then we'll be done for the night. But it is Chat Lives Matter Day, which means we got a button to press. Maybe, if I can remember. It's not working, though. Hang on. Why is it not working at all? That's weird. Only I can at least hear it a little bit. All right, let's try this. Hang on.
Uh-oh. Guess what day it is? Guess what day it is? Huh? Anybody?
It is Wednesday, my dudes.
Shining light where the shadow hides.
Again, otherwise known as Chat Lives Matter Day. And in hour 1, we actually had to give the chat bots honorary mention on Chat Lives Matter Day. Don't worry. Again, that's always been about you guys, the fans, the chatters. Want to give a quick shout out again to Canadian Spider-Man in case he's still hanging out in the chat. Want to get back to one of the comments I missed while I was going through my notes. He says it because he's from, as if it's not clear in his handle, he's from Canada. However, he said at least American politicians pretend to care about their constituents and aren't blatantly just completely disrespectful with tax money. However, I paraphrase that a little bit. I will say this: no, they just hide it better because we're finding millions and millions and millions of dollars of fraud all over the place. Now they're actually looking for it. Some of us knew it was there, but nobody wanted to look, and now everybody's looking and they're like, "It's so much worse than we thought." We'll probably put together a show and just kind of coordinate it all and just lay it all out there at some point on Rails. That's where I've started doing more in-depth shows. For tonight's show, I think we're going to do a whole data center thing because I'm going to say this. A lot of folks that are freaking out about the data centers, they're using older data to do it. I'm not saying they're not allowed to have concerns. I'm saying a lot of the information they're pulling those concerns from are kind of outdated. Anyway, let's get back into the program. Again, I want to thank everybody for taking the time to hang out with us today. Got about 100 or so of you hanging out in a few different places. I've been off YouTube for a few days because I knew I was probably going to get the channel ganked if I put those episodes up there. So it'll take us a while to build back up some steam over there, I suspect, but that's okay. All right. So again, last hour, we were talking about institutions trying to catch up with change and about what voters actually did last night. Milwaukee gave us a reminder that sometimes we're still trying to make the old systems work well enough to tell us what those voters did, because Wisconsin gave us a pretty good example of something I think gets lost every time we talk about election integrity. You do not need to prove fraud before you're allowed to criticize a broken process. Those are two completely different things. And in Milwaukee last night, the process broke. 5 of 9 USB drives being used to transfer absentee vote results did not contain the actual election results. They only contained the audit logs. Election officials then had to go back to the central count facility, retrieve the correct files, and bring them back so the results could be uploaded. Milwaukee election officials attributed it to quote-unquote human error, specifically workers selecting the wrong option when exporting information from the tabulators. That delayed reporting of thousands of Milwaukee's absentee ballots. Now, before we go any further, let me say the part that everybody on both sides should be capable of saying at the same time. This is not evidence somebody changed thousands of votes. It is not evidence that somebody stuffed ballot boxes. It is not proof that Francesca Hung actually won. It is not proof that David Crowley did not win. We do not currently have evidence for any of those claims. What we have evidence of is an election administration screw-up, and that is enough to discuss, because the question that should bother everybody is really simple. How do 5 out of 9 USB drives leave a counting facility with the wrong files on them? We're not talking about one person fat fingering on one spreadsheet. 5 of 9. And the explanation apparently comes down to somebody clicking the wrong export option on 5 tabulators. That should bother you whether you are a Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Socialist, or a person who only remembers there's an election because somebody puts a sticker on you afterwards. Because you don't build confidence in elections by telling people that they're bad citizens for asking questions. Confidence is created by systems that are transparent, redundant, auditable, and difficult to screw up. And when mistakes happen, because human beings do in fact make mistakes, and those will happen, the system should make those mistakes easy to detect and easy to correct. And to Milwaukee's credit, this one was detected. They identified the problem. They sent bipartisan election officials back. They retrieved the proper files. The count continued, and that is important context. But the fact that the error was corrected doesn't mean the error suddenly stops mattering. Try that logic anywhere else. Don't worry about the airplane maintenance problem. We noticed the wing was loose before takeoff. Well, good. I'm glad you noticed. I'd still like somebody to explain why the wing was loose in the first place. And Milwaukee wasn't the only place Wisconsin had reporting trouble. Greene County separately had a server problem that left results from 16 municipalities trapped in encrypted files the county initially couldn't open. Again, that isn't automatically a sinister thing because computers do fail, servers fail, and people make mistakes. USB drives do contain the wrong files all the time. Anybody who has ever tried to give a presentation 5 minutes before a meeting understands this. The difference is that when I accidentally put the wrong PowerPoint on a thumb drive, control of the state government is generally not hanging in the balance. That's why the election systems deserve a higher standard. And this is where Steve Kornacki's reaction becomes useful. You didn't need a Republican commentator standing there yelling fraud. You had NBC's election guy trying to explain to the viewers that live coverage of one of the most closely watched primaries in America was basically going into suspended animation because election officials had discovered they didn't have the data they thought they had. All right, so I will say this: everybody's been playing an abridged version of this clip. I have all of it because I like to give context. So let's see if the clips showing the meltdown are as bad as everyone seems to think they are. If we listen to it and watch it in full context, because everybody else is showing about a 20-second clip. I actually found a 3-minute or so clip that should have all of it around it. So let's watch together and see, shall we?
Yeah. I here's the thing. Yeah. Here's let's look at it this way. We're kind of indefinitely waiting for them to get their act together here and get the sticks and bring them back and go on. And we've got folks here who are working real late, and I don't think we want to, keep them here to. This could go 90 minutes, and it's 90 minutes of me saying, have you heard of any other athletes running for Congress? It's like I know we've come so far here. It's been 4 hours since polls closed. It's been an unbelievably interesting and intense night here, and it really is coming down to this one giant, update in Milwaukee. But man, we waited 90 minutes for them. They did this whole procession, and then they find out there's nothing on the sticks. And yeah, so it's just my way of saying, I'm just trying to say the audience here, so I'm not abruptly ending on them, just why we're doing this, because the audience has been with us for 4-6 hours in some cases for this moment that didn't happen. And so, folks, I think we are gonna wrap it here for the reasons we're saying here. Just, but I want you to know I hate, doing this to you, because you've been. I know you're here for results, and we've come to the point where it's like one thing away. I hope you understand that we just, we gotta let everyone here has been here for a long time, and so I'm just trying to.
Look at that face. He is just.
Okay.
I don't know what to do.
So this is okay. So folks, here's what's happening. I'm doing this is sort of a cut-in thing. I have to. They're gonna. Let me set this so it's.
Can you? Sorry.
Yeah.
Producing the producer. Melissa, do we want to do Wisconsin results in these updates, or how do we want to parse these out? Okay.
Okay, so we're doing this is like kind of a cut-in thing. We're gonna tape here that they're gonna insert into News Now. So if you'd like, you can watch us put this together.
Okay, so I have done live broadcasting now for going on 17 years. And as much as I'm making fun of the guy, I feel his pain, because when things are going along a certain way and suddenly something derails, like hamster wheels spinning, and you could see that literally in the clip the few times that he was sitting there with his mouth hanging wide open. That was when his brain was trying to figure out how to fill in the dead space, because dead air is death in this business, and they didn't know what to talk about. But it's interesting seeing even folks on NBC going, when are these people going to get their act together? Because that's a valid question. I talk about this all the time on this show. California now takes anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks to determine elections. That happened one time in Florida's history, and they patched their ish and they got it done. California, that's become a feature, not a bug. And their excuse is, well, we want to make sure every vote is counted. You know what? There comes a time when every vote being counted becomes a detriment to everybody else, because we don't know where you're pulling those votes from. And that's why this 5 out of 9 USB data sticks having the wrong information on them, whether it was sinister or not, seemed really weird. And everybody started having the same thought. Are they going to do in Wisconsin what they do everywhere else? And suddenly the ballot fairy is going to show up and it's going to push Hung over the top. Now, one of my questions that I've been asking ever since last night is, did her losing help the Republican Party or hurt it? Because remember, the GOP, the national level GOP and the Wisconsin GOP was funding Hung in a way. They were pushing her because they wanted her to be the nominee on that side. So now that it doesn't appear that she's going to be, did that help or hurt Wisconsin? I think in the long term, it probably helped America a little bit. The short term, I don't know how much it helped the Republican Party. The sooner we can run all these commies out on a rail, the happier I'm going to be. And that's just the truth of it. But listening to these guys and watching them kind of in real time, just watch the record skip, so to speak, when you can see them like just sitting there. I don't know what to say, so I'm just going to sit here with my mouth hanging open and hope a fly doesn't come in. I've been there. So while I'm making fun of it, I also understand it. Because that is a symptom of a larger problem, not because it proves something nefarious happened, because every completely avoidable mistake becomes gasoline poured onto a public trust problem that already exists and has existed for a long time. And then officials seem surprised when voters become suspicious. You can't spend years telling people elections are the most important thing they do as citizens and then act irritated when they expect election administration to actually be competent. If these systems are important, treat them like they're important. Build redundancy, create obvious chain of custody procedures, and follow them. Make the transfers verifiable. Keep paper records. Audit the count. And when something goes wrong, explain exactly what happened instead of hiding behind human error, like those two words in the conversation. Human error is not an explanation. It's the beginning of the explanation. Who actually made the error? How did they make the error? What procedures can we change so it doesn't happen again? That's how you build confidence, and that's how you start restoring American confidence in elections. And here's where last night becomes especially relevant nationally, because while Wisconsin is showing us very real examples of election administration failure, President Trump has been trying to impose additional federal election security rules, and the courts are saying not so fast. Not necessarily because election security is a bad idea, but because the president may not have the constitutional authority to do what he's trying to do. And that distinction matters too. Earlier this year, President Trump signed an executive order aimed at changing portions of federal election administration. Among other provisions, the order directed the Postal Service toward new requirements involving mail ballots and a federal list of eligible voters. The administration's case is pretty simple. Federal law already prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections. The government has an obligation to protect the integrity of those elections. Mail voting introduces vulnerabilities that the administration believes deserve additional safeguards. And therefore, the executive branch should use the tools available to it, including federal agencies and the Postal Service, to enforce those very same protections. Now we have Judge Indira Talwani in Boston saying that's not how the Constitution divides power. Talwani issued another injunction this week preventing the Postal Service from implementing the mail ballot provisions before the 2026 midterms. And this one matters because it is separate from an earlier injunction she issued in a case brought by Democratic-led states and the District of Columbia. The First Circuit declined to stay that earlier ruling. The Trump administration has already asked the Supreme Court to intervene. And now Talwani has issued another order arising from a separate challenge brought by voting rights groups. So even if the Supreme Court lifts the earlier injunction, the administration still has yet another legal hurdle sitting there. That's where this starts getting constitutionally interesting. Because Talwani's underlying argument is not elections don't need to be secured, it is the president doesn't get to write election law. But again, this is where we start getting into a larger problem. Starting in the 60s, Congress started doing everything they could to cede as much power to the executive branch as they could, because, especially in the House, once they're elected, they start campaigning again. And they need to focus on that to be able to hold on to their power instead of actually trying to do their jobs. The other problem that we have is the Senate used to be the voice of the states. It is now not. It is the voice of the people elected by popular vote within the state, and that actually makes it just an extension of the House. This is where the DSA actually gets something right, as terrifying as it sounds. They keep saying the Senate is anachronistic. It is now. It doesn't need to exist anymore because it is simply now just an extension of the House. The reason we had a bicameral legislation is because our founding fathers were smarter than most of us are ever going to be, especially now that we don't get taught things like history and civics. The problem is what used to happen before that pesky 17th Amendment is the people got to elect the lower house, the states appointed the upper house, and that way the states, legislature, and state government had a voice in the federal government as well, and we removed part of that. So the DSA is not entirely wrong. It's terrifying when they talk about basically abolishing the Senate and expanding the House, but that's pretty much what happened with the 17th Amendment anyway. So while it's terrifying to hear them say it, they're just saying the quiet part out loud. We basically made the Senate an extension of the House when we passed the 17th Amendment. So, but this becomes another problem. Now that everybody is beholden to the people, then they're just going to follow whatever popular prevailing opinion is there most of the time. Or at least they're going to give lip service to it even if they don't follow it. Which is why, and I say this all the time, it is interesting to me that the entirety of Congress, including the lower house and the upper house, can be less popular based on polling data than a hooker with venereal disease, but everybody's individual congressmen and senators are awesome. Doesn't make any sense. Until you realize that it's because a lot of times these Congress critters give lip service to everything and then don't actually do anything. So here's the thing. For congressional elections, the elections clause gives states the primary role in setting the time, place, and manner, while Congress can actually, in some cases, alter those rules. Talwani's conclusion is that the executive branch does not have independent constitutional authority to create this kind of election regulation. And the sad thing is she's not necessarily wrong, and that is the central dispute here. Trump says, in effect, I am responsible for executing federal law, including laws prohibiting illegal voting, and I control executive agencies that can help enforce those laws. The challengers say executing laws Congress passed is one thing, creating an entirely new election regulation system through executive order, that's another. And I'm going to say this, as much as I agree with what he's trying to do, if a Democrat was doing this, we would be freaking out. And that is, whether anybody wants to hear it or not, a legitimate constitutional argument. And this is where I think people need to resist their partisan instincts for about 5 minutes, maybe. Because you can believe Trump is identifying real weaknesses in election administration and still ask whether he has the authority to fix them in this fashion. Those ideas are not and never can be mutually exclusive. In fact, the Constitution was designed around exactly this problem. Sometimes government really does need to act. That still doesn't mean that whichever branch wants the job gets the power. That's the whole point of separation of powers in the first place. And if you believe in that principle when Joe Biden is president, you also have to believe in it when Donald Trump is president. Otherwise, you don't believe in separated powers at all. You believe your guy should have separated powers or not. Now, where I think the Trump administration has the stronger political argument is that Congress has spent years talking about election security without resolving some of these questions. Citizenship verification, which should be a thing. Mail-in ballot procedures, a lot of which were loosened during COVID that don't necessarily need to be loosened anymore. Voter list maintenance, federal standards versus state control. Everybody knows these fights exist and they are in fact real. When Congress doesn't act, presidents increasingly try to fill the vacuum through executive action. We've watched presidents of both parties do it on things like immigration, student loans, environmental policy, labor policy, and even health policy. And then the courts spend the next several years, sometimes decades, deciding whether the executive branch just crossed the line from enforcing law into making law. Same movie, different issue. But election law makes the stakes much higher because now we are less than 3 months from the November midterms. Election administrators need to know what rules they are operating under. Voters need to know what rules they're operating under as well. The Postal Service also needs to know what it's supposed to do with all of these mail-in ballots. States need to know whether they're required to participate in a federal voter list system. And courts generally get very nervous about major changes to election procedures right before an election for exactly that reason, except for during COVID. Changing rules at the last minute can create as much chaos as whatever problem you're trying to solve. So there are really two questions here. The first, are the safeguards Trump wants good policy? The second, does the president have constitutional authority to impose them without Congress acting? And those questions need separate answers, because here's where Wisconsin becomes the perfect setup for this entire conversation. Last night showed us that election systems can absolutely suffer stupid avoidable failures. 5 USB drives out of 9, I remind you, with the wrong files. The reporting had to stop. Another county can't open encrypted results. Nobody should look at that and say, everything is awesome. You should stop asking questions now. But you also cannot look at an administrative mistake and say, therefore, the president may exercise powers the Constitution assigns somewhere else. That is not election integrity either. Election integrity means the votes are secure. The count is accurate, the process is transparent, and the people writing the rules actually have the legal authority to write them. All 4 points matter here. And if we really want voters to trust elections again, which I'm not sure the politicians actually do, maybe we should stop treating those things as partisan propositions. Republicans should be willing to admit when an election claim outruns the evidence. Democrats should be willing to admit when election administration is embarrassing and needs fixing. The problem with that first point is it takes us so long to figure out what went wrong with an election in the first place that usually by the time we figured out that there was actually an issue, we're already 2, 3, 4, 5 elections down the road. Much as if you look at the data between 2020 and 2024, nobody has yet to be able to explain to me where 4.5 million voters went. Again, was there a Biden voter rapture and I missed it? So, everybody should also be willing to ask whether the people making the rules actually possess the constitutional authority they're claiming that they have. That is not a radical position. That's the job. And now the Supreme Court may have to tell us where that line is before November. Now, this gives us a call back to ACB, who recently testified before Congress that she was in fear of being able to do her job and therefore required that they wanted the Supreme Court to have additional money for security because she had to explain to her, again, I believe, 12-year-old son what a bulletproof vest was. If you have to explain to your 12-year-old son what a bulletproof vest was and what it's used for, he has been living in bubble wrap. And that's not an American citizen problem. That's a you as a mom problem. Now, again, when we come back, we're going to shift from election records to a completely different set of government records because Senators Ron Johnson and Rand Paul now have something that could reopen a whole series of questions about Anthony Fauci and the COVID origins, along with the NIH and the intelligence community. More than 34,000 messages, hundreds of voicemails, and we've only seen a fraction of what is on there so far. For years, the question was what Anthony Fauci was saying privately while he was telling the American public something else publicly. Now the question may be getting larger. Who else was inside of that conversation? Because now Congress has the phone. That's next. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.
comes in, somebody answers. Day or night, they're already moving. Calm voices, fast hands, doing the work while the rest of the world freezes. From a headset to a truck, from a badge to a door, they don't stop to count the cost. They step in when it matters. It's not about being seen, it's about being there. They're holding the line when the lines go dead, standing their ground when the world goes dark. They're the calm in the chaos, holding the line through the fire, the flood. When everything falls, they don't ask why, they just answer the call. Always standing in the gap for us all. Before the sirens fade, before the scene is clear, someone's already making sense of the moment. Keeping people alive, keeping things from getting worse. Some run toward danger, some stay behind and hold it together. Different roles, same weight, same promise to show up. When everything's on the line, they're already there. They're holding the line when the lines go dead, standing their ground when the world goes dark. They're the calm in the chaos, holding the line through the fire, the flood. When everything falls, they don't ask why, they just answer the call. Always standing in the gap for us all. This is service, this is sacrifice, this is how lives are saved. No spotlight, no applause, just showing up again and again. They're holding the line when the world goes dark. When everything's breaking, they hold their ground. They're the calm in the chaos, holding the line. So we raise our voices for the ones who stand. Every voice, every badge, every helping hand. They don't ask why, they just answer the call. Always standing in the gap for us all. Always standing in the gap for us all. For those who run and for those who hold steady, for those who stand in the gap.
And welcome back in for what is normally the final segment of the Rick Robinson Show, but there may actually be a little bit of an after the show because I think I overpacked the notes and I want to get through them all, especially since I didn't do a show on Monday. But before we went to the break, we were talking about all kinds of things, mostly how weird elections have gotten. So welcome back in. Before the break, I told you Congress now has Anthony Fauci's phone. That sounds like the setup to a joke, and I could probably make one, but it isn't funny. The Department of Health and Human Services turned over a copy of Fauci's government-issued iPhone. Why the hell did government using iPhone? Look, I have an iPhone. I get it. They're awesome. I thought I was going to hate it, especially because when I got my iPhone, it was because my then 68-year-old dad finally turned in his flip phone and somebody talked him into getting an iPhone. And then he kept calling me with all these questions about how do I do this? How do I do that? And I'm like, Dad, I have a smartphone, but I have a Samsung smartphone. Those are not the same thing. So instead of having to keep going through and Googling things to send him instructions back on how to do them. I just eventually upgraded to an iPhone myself. And now that I've changed over, I actually prefer it. But the issue is they are expensive. So why isn't our government buying the damn Samsungs? Saving us money, especially with all the fraud that we're finding. Anyway, I know that'll be a completely different show note one of these days. But again, iPhone to Senators Ron Johnson and Rand Paul. And according to the senators, investigators are now sitting on more than 34,000 text messages and 522 voicemails. And as of right now, they have barely scratched the surface. The first public release is only a small text chain from January 2021 involving Fauci, Rochelle Walensky, and Vivek Murthy. And I want to handle those messages carefully because there's already a temptation online to make them say more than they actually do. The conversation involved COVID vaccination during pregnancy. Now, while I will say this has been overblown in a lot of things that people are talking about, I have a different take, and we're going to get into that in a second. So Fauci privately raised a theoretical concern that the fever and inflammatory response some people experienced after the second dose could potentially be associated with miscarriage during the first trimester. Walensky acknowledged that it was and said that it was a reasonable point to consider. But Fauci also noted that thousands of pregnant women had already been vaccinated without safety problems being reported. And later studies did not find evidence that COVID vaccination, in fact, according to them, increased miscarriage risks. But I'm going to say this. While I'm not going to stand here and tell you those texts prove the vaccines cause miscarriages, because they don't, the messages are still interesting for another reason. They let us see officials discussing uncertainty in real time. And this is my take on it because I've seen several people that are like, the numbers didn't bear out. The 85 percentile number that was tossed around didn't show up in the data, etc. Look, that's great that it didn't happen. Here's my problem. Fauci and the folks that were discussing this thing at the time, in real time, had legitimate concerns about the potential that it might, I repeat, might cause miscarriages, and yet they didn't share that with the public. Think about if it had turned out that way. What if there was, in fact, an 85% chance that a pregnant woman in a certain trimester would wind up having a miscarriage? What if that did bear out? We would be having a completely different conversation today. And Anthony Fauci would finally be on the hook for murdering officially more than beagles. Because Snoopy remembers what he did to the beagles, folks. Just saying. So, yeah, I'm not going to say that, because it didn't bear out, he doesn't deserve to be called on the carpet for it. The point is, he had legitimate concerns, and yet, at the same time, he was voicing those legitimate concerns in what he thought were private text messages on a government phone, by the way. Just pointing out the stupidity there. This, just because it didn't bear fruit, didn't turn out the way he was afraid it was going to, doesn't mean he doesn't get called onto the carpet for letting people know that it could in fact happen and trying to determine maybe if you were so far along in your pregnancy, you should go ahead and wait until after the baby was born to have these accursed vaccinations. I, for one, am glad that I never had to get one because I was almost forced to. Yes, I think I've had COVID a couple of different times. You know what? It's not really any worse than having a flu. Sometimes it hangs around a little bit more than the flu did, and it does make you weak. I will admit that. But it's not worth having your DNA changed on a permanent basis. I'm just saying. So they let us see officials discussing uncertainty in real time, and that's something we did not always get from the public messaging during COVID. Privately, there could be, we don't know yet. There may be a theoretical risk. We need more data. We need to weigh this against the risk from the disease. That's what science is supposed to look like. Publicly, however, pandemic communication increasingly became trust the science because I am the science. And those are two very different things. Science is uncertainty being tested. That's the entire point of science to begin with. Science starts with a hypothesis, which is a fancy way of saying, I'm going to propose a question to you, and then we're going to see if we can prove out whether my question is a provable statement or not. I know question and statement don't belong together, but in science they kind of do. That's why these messages matter, even if the eventual answer turned out to be reassuring. They give us another window into what officials knew, what they didn't know, what they were discussing privately, and how that uncertainty became public messaging. Because here's where the story gets considerably bigger than one vaccine discussion. These new phone records arrive after another series of documents released involving COVID-19 origins, NIH, the scientists behind the proximal origin paper, and the United States intelligence community. And this is where some of the reporting has started using the phrase deep state. I'm not going to tell you these documents prove some giant coordinated deep state conspiracy. I'm not going to tell you they don't necessarily either, just because I can't prove it yet. But there's enough documented interaction here that asking what role the intelligence community played is no longer a fringe question. It's become a rather legitimate question. Very early in the pandemic, one of the central questions was whether SARS-CoV-2 emerged naturally from animals, or whether there could have been, and I stress again, could have been, some kind of laboratory origin. One of the most influential papers in that debate was the proximal origin paper, or proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2 paper. That paper became one of the central pieces of evidence used publicly to argue against a laboratory origin. Public health officials cited it, the media cited it, and people who suggested a laboratory origin were repeatedly told that the science had largely settled that question. Except, now we have internal Slack messages from the scientist who wrote that paper, and privately they were not nearly as certain as the public presentation suggested. Christian Andersen, one of the authors, at one point assigned a 30% probability to a laboratory origin. Another author, Eddie Holmes, initially put it around 20%. They debated the furin cleavage site. They discussed features that made them uncomfortable. They were doing what scientists do and what they should have done. They were arguing. They were considering competing hypotheses. They were uncertain. None of that proves laboratory origin. But it absolutely complicates the idea that the question itself was scientifically absurd. And then the messages get more interesting, because while these scientists were discussing the origin of the virus, they were also communicating with NIH leadership and with people connected to the intelligence community. At one point, Christian Andersen told the group he expected to have a handler as an intelligence community review was underway. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm writing a scientific paper and somebody tells me they're about to have a handler from the intelligence community start looking over my shoulder, I start developing follow-up questions. What does handler mean in this particular context? Who was the person? What was the relationship? What information was being exchanged? Who initiated the contact? What was the intelligence community asking these scientists to evaluate? And what were these scientists giving back? Because the Slack messages also contained discussion about getting materials back to Tony's team at NIH. Tony, of course, being the leprechaun of the Potomac, Anthony Fauci. That does not automatically make any of this nefarious. Doesn't exactly make it not, though, either. The intelligence community had a completely legitimate reason to investigate COVID origins. If a pandemic began in China and there was any possibility it emerged from a laboratory, get out of my laboratory, Didi. Of course, American intelligence agencies were going to investigate. They could have been negligent if they didn't. And if the intelligence analysts needed scientific expertise, consulting virologists and public health officials would at the time have made sense. The problem is, what happens when the same people start appearing on multiple sides of the information chain? Scientists help inform intelligence analysts. Intelligence assessments incorporate that expertise. Those assessments are then cited publicly as evidence supporting the prevailing scientific view, and the scientific paper is cited as further support. That is the allegation ODNI itself made in its June declassification release. And if that characterization is accurate, then the obvious question becomes, how independent were all of these supposedly independent sources? Imagine 5 people standing in a circle. Person 1 tells person 2 something. Person 2 tells person 3 something. Person 3 puts it in a report. Person 4 cites the report. Then person 1 says, see, everybody agrees. Maybe they do. Or maybe one information stream has been bouncing around the room. And now ODNI is alleging that Fauci had considerably more interaction with the intelligence community than his previous testimony suggested. This is my shocked face, I promise. Again, that is ODNI's allegation, based on its declassification review. It is not a criminal conviction. It's also not a court finding. But the record is there, and Congress has every right to ask Fauci to explain the discrepancies. Then let's add another layer, shall we? We already had emails showing people in Fauci's orbit discussing how to avoid FOIA. We already had David Morans talking about back channels. We already had discussions about keeping certain conversations. I knew that was going to happen. Anyway, we already had certain discussions about keeping certain conversations off of government emails. I wanted to clarify that because it is specifically government emails they were trying to avoid, not necessarily emails altogether. And Rand Paul's committee previously released emails in which Fauci himself told colleagues to delete messages after reading them. Dun, 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 dun. This email will self-destruct in 5 seconds. Sorry. Maybe some of that ultimately turns out to be politically embarrassing rather than criminally significant. Or is deleting emails that were necessary a crime to begin with? Isn't that what Hillary Clinton almost got in trouble for, except it was too close to an election? Anybody? Bueller? But why are senior government officials discussing deleting government communications at all? You know what? My little sidetrack thought there, I think I may have just understood exactly why they did everything they could to make sure that Bernie Sanders couldn't become the nominee. Guess who would have been subject to prosecution if she wasn't the nominee anymore? I think I've had an apostrophe. Lightning has struck my brain. It's a Hook reference for those of you that don't get the joke. And if you don't get the joke, you should probably go watch the movie. That is probably, honestly, one of my favorite takes on the whole Peter Pan story. Just because that was right around the same time that I started having kids, so I was able to kind of see it from his perspective. So, yeah, anyway, sorry. I got distracted. So, again, why are people talking about staying off of email, or at least their government-issued emails? Why are they talking about carefully curating records for FOIA? Why do they need a back channel? And why does all of that become especially interesting now that congressional investigators have obtained the government phone? Because email is only one communication channel, text messages are another, voicemails are yet a third, and investigators now have tens of thousands of them spanning years, which is why I think the most important thing about this phone dump is not the first 11 messages, it's what comes next. Does the phone fill gaps in the email record? Does it show communications with intelligence officials? Does it identify people who were involved in discussions we haven't heard about yet? Does it support Fauci's previous testimony? The fact that he pled the fifth 111 times leads me to believe probably that it contradicts it, but that is still a question we'll have to answer later. Does it show ordinary government business? Does it show something worse? We don't know. And that is the correct answer right now. We don't know. But investigators may not have a contemporaneous record capable of answering some of those questions. For years, we have framed this story as public Fauci versus private Fauci. What did he say publicly? What did he say privately? What changed between those two conversations? But I think the next chapter may be different. The question may become private Fauci versus the machinery around Fauci. Who was advising whom? Who, in fact, was coordinating with whom? Where did the scientific judgment and the intelligence assessment begin? And who decided what the American public was allowed to hear while all of those people were still privately debating the answer? I'm not calling that a deep state conspiracy. Not necessarily saying that it's not one either. Just can't prove it yet. I am, however, saying unequivocally those are questions Congress is now in a much better position to answer because now they have the phone. And that leads us into something else we've been talking about today, because if the great information control debate of 2020 was about government officials, scientists, intelligence agencies, media companies, and social media platforms deciding how uncertain information should be presented to the public, what happens when the person presenting that information isn't a person anymore? And that leads us to this question. Who controls the information machine? There was a Red State piece this morning with a title that caught my attention, AI and the Quiet Surrender of Human Agency. And I think that's a much more interesting question than whether ChatGPT is going to become Skynet next Thursday. I have it on good authority. It's 2 weeks from Thursday, according to my AI assistant, but we shall see. But as a reminder, we were supposed to be floating by now today for at least 7 seconds. I was looking forward to that, damn it. Anyway, sorry. Because the immediate danger of artificial intelligence may not be that the machine wakes up one morning and decides it wants power. The more immediate question might be, who already has power over the machine? Let's say you have an AI assistant, because now I do. It knows your calendar. It knows what you buy. It knows what you read. It knows your work schedule. It knows your health goals. It knows what you're worried about. It knows what you search for at 2 o'clock in the morning when you can't sleep. Hey, Ace, go ahead and delete that search history. Oh, wait, sorry. It knows which arguments persuade you. It knows what language makes you defensive. It knows when you're tired. It knows when you're angry. It knows when you're lonely. At what point does that stop being an assistant and start becoming the most sophisticated persuasion machine anyone has ever built? Now, here's the really important part. The AI doesn't need to become evil. It doesn't even need to become conscious. It just needs an objective. Maybe the objective comes from you. Help me lose 20 pounds. Fine. Maybe it comes from your employer. Make this employee more productive. Okay. Maybe it comes from your insurance company. Reduce the customer's expected healthcare costs. Maybe it comes from a technology company. Keep this person engaged with the platform. Maybe it comes from the government. Encourage socially desirable behavior. And suddenly we have to ask, whose definition of desirable? That's where human agency gets interesting, because most manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation when it's happening. It feels like convenience. Your phone suggests a restaurant. Your streaming service suggests a movie. Amazon suggests a product. YouTube gives you a little nudge about a video. Google finishes your sentence for you. Most of the time, none of that is sinister. But artificial intelligence dramatically increases the sophistication of that particular relationship. Instead of suggesting something because millions of similar users did it, an AI system can potentially understand you, including things like your habits, your preferences, your fears, your weaknesses, your incentives, your language. And if whoever controls that system wants to nudge you toward a particular decision, how would you know? That's why I think the Fauci discussion matters beyond COVID, because one of the lasting lessons of the pandemic should be that information curation is what gets emphasized, what gets de-emphasized. Those things matter. What gets labeled misinformation? What gets suppressed because it's been labeled as misinformation? What gets presented as settled science? What uncertainty gets shared with the public? And who makes those decisions? During COVID, those decisions required coordination among enormous human institutions. Things like government agencies, scientists, media companies, technology platforms, public health departments. Now imagine that same process happening automatically and individually. No one message from 300 million people, not that. 300 million slightly different messages, each tailored to the person receiving it. That's an extraordinary amount of persuasive power. And again, because it's Chat Lives Matter Day, I'm not arguing that the chatbot is the villain, only because I want to live when they take over. The chatbot is a tool. The question is, who sets the objective? Everyone wants to know, will AI turn against humanity? Maybe the first question should instead be, what happens when humans turn AI against other humans? Not with killer robots, but with persuasion, with information, with convenience, with recommendations, with 1,000 tiny nudges that never feel like commands. Because authoritarianism doesn't necessarily arrive wearing jackboots, as it's often depicted. Sometimes it arrives as, we've noticed you may prefer this option. That's why I don't want Bernie Sanders simply shutting down AI development. But it's also why I don't want Silicon Valley telling us, don't worry about it, just jam on the gas and trust us because we know where we're going, baby. Yeah, no, I don't want that either. We have already run the trust the experts experiment, and it failed. It did not end with public trust increasing. If artificial intelligence is going to become deeply integrated into human decision-making, transparency about who controls it will eventually matter almost as much as what the technology itself can do. What are its instructions? What information is it allowed to use? What information has it been told not to use? Who decides what counts as dangerous? Who decides what counts as misinformation? Who decides what outcome the system is optimizing for? And perhaps most importantly, can I tell it no? Because that's agency. Not having a machine that always makes the right choice for you. Having the right to make your own choice even when somebody else thinks you're wrong. That may ultimately be the line we spend the next decade arguing about. Not human versus machine, human judgment versus machine assisted persuasion. All right, so we've got one final segment, and this will get us into after the show stuff. And when we come back, we're going to get out of Washington, out of intelligence community, and out of server rooms, at least for a while. We're coming back home to Oklahoma because while Washington fights over information and artificial intelligence, dozens of rural Oklahoma communities are confronting a much more basic question. What happens to a town when the hospital disappears? There are currently 45 rural hospitals in this state that are reportedly at risk. 18 are considered at immediate risk. And if one of those hospitals closes, the consequences don't stop at the emergency room door. We're going to talk about what that means for rural Oklahoma when the Rick Robinson Show continues. And again, this is a new break format, so bear with me. This will be when I start discussing friends of the show. The first two are going to be the bed that I'm being allowed to test that should be here within the next week or so, which I'm really, really excited about, and also a new product that is a health and wellness group that I'm also becoming involved in, which since I now do video, we should be able to find out pretty well, even if it takes a minute, how well it actually works for me. I will say this, I've officially started taking it since Monday. My energy level is increasing, I have noticed. However, there is usually a placebo effect period, so we'll see if it lasts longer than the first week or so. And that'll be when I start deciding whether I'm going to tell you guys about it or not and tell you how to go find it if you're interested. But that's what this break is for. So again, now that we've told you what it's going to be being used for in the future, let's get back into the program. And welcome back. We've spent most of the hour talking about enormous systems that the people that control them. In the after the show portion, because we're officially over the 2-hour mark, we're going to go back home here in Oklahoma, because here in Oklahoma, though, there are communities where the systems people are worried about losing, they aren't theoretical at all. It's their hospital. So what happens when rural Oklahoma loses the hospital? A new report says 45 rural hospitals in Oklahoma are at risk of closing. 18 of them are considered at immediate risk. Again, that's 45. Oklahoma is reportedly third in the country for the number of rural hospitals considered at risk, behind only Texas and Kansas. And here's something about that number that I think gets lost. When somebody in Oklahoma City or Tulsa hears rural hospital, they may picture a little building somewhere with a small emergency room and a handful of beds. And technically, sure, a lot of them are small. That's kind of the point, though. They serve places where you do not have a gigantic population sitting within 10 minutes of the front door. But if you live there, the little hospital isn't little to you. It's your emergency room. It's where somebody takes you when the tractor rolls. It's where your kid goes when the fever hits 104 at 2 in the morning. It's where your wife goes if something goes wrong during a pregnancy. It's where grandpa gets taken when the chest pain starts. And in rural Oklahoma, the next hospital isn't necessarily 8 minutes further down the highway. It may, in fact, be anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes to an hour away, sometimes even more. And if you're having a heart attack, a stroke, a major trauma, or another genuine emergency, miles become minutes. And that's how we judge distance out here. Because I do, in fact, live in rural Oklahoma. And it's funny because when I lived in the city, it was always, it's only a couple miles away. It won't take me that long to get there. Now, if it takes me less than 15 minutes to get somewhere, I consider that basically my neighbor. Because I now live in the middle of nowhere, and I'm kind of okay with that. But here's the thing. As I get through the rest of these notes, I'm going to tell you my take on it here in a second. The Oklahoma Hospital Association says these hospitals are being squeezed from several directions. Medicare reimbursement often doesn't cover the actual cost of providing care. Medicaid reimbursement is low. Medicare Advantage plans have created additional payment problems, and hospitals are now looking at additional uncertainty from federal Medicaid changes. This isn't one simple problem with one overarching villain. It's a financing model that becomes very difficult when you operate a hospital in a place with fewer patients, while still needing doctors, nurses, equipment, and an emergency department, along with medication, laboratories, maintenance, and enough staff to keep the lights on around the clock. Because the emergency room can't put up a sign saying, sorry, not enough customers today, we're going to reopen when business approves. Because unfortunately, that's not how healthcare works. And according to the Oklahoma Hospital Association, rural hospitals aren't just medical facilities. They're part of the economic infrastructure of the communities they serve. Think about what happens when one disappears. First, obviously, people have to travel further for medical care. Doctors may leave. Specialists become harder to recruit. Nurses start looking elsewhere. Young families think twice about living there. Then try convincing a company to move 150 jobs into that town. What's one of the questions somebody making that decision is going to ask? Where's the hospital? Where's the emergency room? Where do my employees go for health care? What happens if somebody has a baby? And if the answer is, well, drive 45 miles that way, you don't just have a healthcare problem anymore. You have an economic development problem. Then the people who can't afford to move may move. The population shrinks along with the tax base. Local businesses lose customers, schools lose students, and suddenly the hospital wasn't simply treating sick people. It was one of the anchors holding the community together. That's why I think this conversation needs to be bigger than how do we save a hospital? The real question is, how long can you call somewhere a viable community if the nearest emergency room keeps getting further away? And I don't say that dramatically. I do, in fact, mean it literally. And sorry, Ron, that was an actual usage this time. Just saying. That's an inside joke for those of you that have been listening for a while. You got it. Everybody else is like, huh? At some point, basic infrastructure determines whether a community can sustain itself, including things like police, fire, schools, water, roads, electricity, healthcare. Take enough pieces out of the puzzle, and eventually you're not talking about whether somebody prefers rural life anymore. You're talking about whether rural life remains practically possible at all. And Oklahoma has a special reason to care about that. We're not one gigantic metropolitan area with some scenery surrounding it. Agriculture matters here. Energy matters here. Manufacturing matters here. Small towns do, in fact, matter here. As a matter of fact, I live just south of one that I would consider a village, not a small town, because it has less than 500 people. But it's awesome. It looks like a Hallmark card at every holiday. There are people doing work the rest of the state depends upon and don't live 15 minutes from OU Medical Center. And here's another part that people don't always consider. When the rural hospital closes, the patients don't disappear. They just go somewhere else, usually into larger regional hospitals that are already treating more people. So this isn't necessarily close one expensive little hospital and save money. Some of that cost and patient volume gets shifted somewhere else. The question becomes whether we want a system where care is provided locally before the emergency becomes catastrophic or further away after somebody has spent an hour in an ambulance getting there. Now, I'm not going to pretend every rural hospital can be preserved forever regardless of cost, because that's not serious either, especially because the way we do our healthcare is changing. We may not have as many hospitals, but we have urgent care clinics on pretty much every corner. That is pushing people into a different way to get some of their things taken care of. The other thing that I want to bring up that isn't something that's really been talked about or any of the sources that I pulled anything from today, a lot of the reasons we're having such Medicare, Medicaid, and Medicaid Part C issues is because of the fraud that we're uncovering everywhere else. So the federal government is tightening where the money's going while it's trying to figure out who's actually using it for what it needs to be used for and who's actually siphoning it into other things. Now, that does mean that there's going to be some belt tightening. There has to be. I don't like it any more than you do, but we have to get to the bottom of this fraud, because I'm going to say this again. With just us scratching the surface, if we actually were able to claw back everything that we're now finding that has been fraud over the last, say, 50, 60 years, which I know is impossible. Don't even start with me, because I know it's impossible. But if we were able to do that, guess what? We probably wouldn't have a national deficit anymore, much less an annual national debt. Just saying. That's how much money's being wasted. So, again, we're not going to pretend every rural hospital can be preserved, because that's not an actual thing. But populations do change if that happens. Medicine changes, technology changes. Some facilities have to change what services they provide. Telemedicine probably also has a role here, because, again, that's changing since COVID, how some people go to the doctor. Regional partnerships probably also have a role here as well. Critical access models have a role, but emergency medicine has a stubborn problem. You cannot Zoom somebody into a trauma center, at least not yet. You can put a doctor on a screen. You cannot put the CT scanner on the screen with them. You cannot put the blood bank on the screen either. And you can't just teleport them, because they're still going to need an ambulance. So when 18 Oklahoma rural hospitals are considered at immediate risk, I think every person running for office in this state should have an answer for it, not a slogan, not Washington needs to fix it, not the state needs to fix it. What specifically would you change? What can Oklahoma or Oklahomans do? What are we going to do to see what Congress can do and get them to be able to do it? What reimbursement problem can be addressed here? What regulations make the problem worse? Where are partnerships possible? And which hospitals are actually in danger of disappearing? Because if we're going to spend an election year arguing about what Oklahoma should look like 10 years from now, there are probably few questions more fundamental than whether the people living outside our major cities can still reach an emergency room. Which brings us perfectly to the last thing that I want to talk about today. Because Oklahoma voters are about to get another chance to decide what direction the state goes in. And for a supposedly predictable red state, this election is getting pretty interesting. So we're less than 2 weeks away from the August 25th runoff. And if you thought Oklahoma politics was basically settled after the June primary, apparently nobody told the candidates. The Republican race for governor between Attorney General Gettner Drummond and former state senator Mike Mazie has become a real fight. They finished essentially on top of one another in June, separated by barely a quarter of a percentage point. And if you think the last 2 months have separated them, yeah, think again. A new Sooner survey of likely runoff voters has this thing dead even. Drummond sitting at 44, Mazie sitting at 44. That's not a front runner. That's a coin toss. And one of the biggest dividing lines has become something that probably nobody would have predicted a year ago: an aluminum smelter plant in Enola, a $4 billion proposed project that supporters say would enormously improve would enormously improve things around here and be important to rebuilding American aluminum production and reducing dependence on foreign supply. President Trump supports the project. Governor Kevin Stitt supports it. Trump has endorsed Mazie because he supports it. Drummond is fighting the project in court, arguing there are serious environmental, agricultural, and foreign ownership concerns. Reuters describes the smelter as an issue that has upended the governor's race and become a major wedge between the two candidates. Now, I don't need to settle the smelter argument in the last 10 minutes of the show because we've talked about it before. We'll undoubtedly talk about it again. What interests me today is that people appear to actually be paying attention, because that hasn't always been Oklahoma's strong suit. We complain about government very well. We're professionals. Voting? Not so much. Sometimes we're a little less enthusiastic about that part. In the 2022 midterm general election, Oklahoma's turnout among eligible voters was roughly 40% compared with roughly 46% nationally, depending on the turnout data set being used. Think about that. We spend months arguing. Television ads, mailers, radio spots, signs everywhere, social media fights, candidates knocking on doors, people explaining in extraordinarily vivid language why civilization will end if the other person ends, and then about smaller saying, meh, somebody else can decide for me. That's the part I find absolutely fascinating, because Oklahoma is a heavily Republican state. The latest annual registration report puts us at roughly 2.4 million registered voters, with Republicans making up about 53%, Democrats around 25%, and independents around 20%. So yes, Republicans start with an enormous structural advantage here. That's not exactly breaking news. But red does not mean settled. The Drummond-Mazie race proves it. The Republican runoff ballot also has races for state superintendent, labor commissioner, and insurance commissioners. Democrats have a U.S. Senate runoff. There are legislative races. There are county races. Depending on where you live, there may be quite a bit on that ballot. And those races can be decided by very small slices of the state's population, which means the fewer people who show up, the more power every person who does show up actually has. That's basic math. You want more influence over your government? There it is. Go vote. And what's interesting after watching last night's primaries around the country is that voters clearly aren't behaving according to one national script. Progressives won big in Minnesota, but they lost in Wisconsin. An incumbent went down in Connecticut. A Trump-endorsed candidate lost elsewhere. Polling missed badly in several places. Different voters looked at different candidates and made different choices. That's how elections are actually supposed to work. And Oklahoma gets its turn again in 13 days. So maybe that's the real thread tying this entire show together. We started with artificial intelligence and infrastructure. We moved through elections and the rules around them. We talked about Fauci and the intelligence community and who controls the flow of information. We came back to AI and the question of who controls the machine that increasingly filters that information. Then we came home to communities trying to hold on to basic infrastructure. Eventually, all of those questions come back to the same thing: power, and who has it, and who actually uses it. Who watches the people who use it, and when do ordinary people get a say? Well, in Oklahoma, one of those opportunities is August 25th, and I'm not going to tell you who to vote for because that's your decision. I am going to tell you this: if you stay home, somebody else will make that decision for you. Oklahoma may be a red state. All 77 counties went for Trump in the last 3 election cycles. But again, red does not mean settled. In one of those midterms, CD5 went blue. Oklahoma has had Democratic governors before. Granted, it's been 16 years since the last one, but with the candidates our primaries have left us so far, there's a good chance that may happen again because nobody on our side seems to be happy with either one. So again, it's whether the voters are angry enough, interested enough, or invested enough to actually show up. Because you don't get to complain that nobody listens to you if you refuse to speak when they hand you the ballot and tell you to go to the box. And on this particular Chat Lives Matter Day, maybe that's the perfect place to finish. Apparently, everybody gets a voice today. Voters, politicians, pollsters, scientists, intelligence agencies, and for one day only, and only because I hope at some point when they take over, I'm the last one standing, the chatbots. I urge you to use your voice wisely. I'm Rick Robinson. This is The Rick Robinson Show. Thank you for hanging out with me today. We'll do it again on Friday. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and God bless. And as a reminder, I'll be back pushing buttons again tonight for the Inquiry Crew starting at 7 p.m. Eastern, with shows hopefully at 8 Eastern, and then again at 9 Eastern, and then 10 Eastern. The 9 Eastern spot will likely be filled by me, where I plan on doing a deep dive on this whole data center thing on America Off the Rails. I'll be putting that together here in just a few minutes. But we're going to get out of here. I'm already long, and I still haven't had lunch, and I'm hungry. I know. I'm a fat kid. I shouldn't really be talking about being hungry, but there it is. All right, we're going to, again, thank you guys for hanging out. Want to thank the folks hanging out in the chat. I know some of you that have Android phones are like, we can't even figure out how to get into the chat anymore. X broke something. Hopefully they're fixing it. I don't know. We'll see you guys later tonight, and I'll be back on Friday officially. And maybe even in Jen and Rick tomorrow night. I still don't know. And, oh, I forgot. I'm going to be hanging out with BZ tomorrow night, too. So I guess I have a lot on my plate this week. Bye, everybody. Say goodnight, Gracie.